Dylan Thomas was born on the 27th of October 1914 at 5 Condombkin Drive, Uplands, Swansea, in the front bedroom of this semi-detached house. He thought of Swansea as both ugly and lovely. A short walk from Dylan's home is Condombkin Park, where he played as a child. This cast-iron drinking fountain was referred to in his poem Hunchback in the Park. Also in the park, there is a memorial stone carved with an extract from his poem Fern Hill. The Uplands area of Swansea was referred to by Dylan as a square handful of shops and a pub. When he walked to school, he noticed that Upland's shops were named in different colours. Mr. Grey Newsagent's, Mr. Green's Sweet Shop, Mr. Black Cobbles, and White's the Shoe Shop. His first school was a private school at 22 Mirador Crescent, Uplands, ran by a Mrs. Hole. This is where he learned to read and count. This building stands on the site of the old Uplands Cinema where Dylan watched Western films. The Uplands Hotel was one of many public houses he visited. In the 1930s, this building, the Church Meeting House, the Grove Uplands, was used as a radio recording studio where Dylan presented a programme, Swansea and the Arts, with a group of friends he referred to as the Boys, who met together in the Cardoma Cafe in Swansea. 69 Glambrindon Avenue, Uplands, was once a grocer's shop and the home of his friend Bert Trick. This is where Dylan and his friends would have meetings, discussions and readings. Dylan visited Warmley 38, Eversley Road, Sketty, to visit his friend Daniel Jones, a professional composer. Their first meeting is described in his story, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Dog, under the title The Fight. This is the Dylan Thomas Centre, Swansea, which houses a permanent display dedicated to Dylan Thomas. A short walk from the Dylan Thomas Centre is the Dylan Thomas Theatre, the home of Swansea's Little Theatre, where Dylan was a member in the 1930s. Near the theatre is a statue dedicated to Dylan Thomas, where the last line of the poem Fern Hill is inscribed. Crossing over the old swing bridge in the marina, and you will see a statue of Captain Cat, the blind sea captain from Undermilk Wood. Swansea Museum was referred in a play by Dylan Thomas, Reminiscences of a Childhood, as a museum that should be in a museum. At the top of Wine Street were the offices of the South Wales Evening Post, which have moved to more modern premises. Dylan joined the Evening Post first as a copy holder, then as a junior reporter. In his story, Old Garbo Dylan refers to the Strand as a slum. It is still pretty old, but being modernised. In Wine Street, there is Salubrious Passage. In a ghost story called The Followers, Dylan renames Salubrious Passage Paradise Alley. He would visit a friend who had a workshop above Salubrious Passage. They would heat pennies until they were red hot, throw them onto the street below, and watch as passers would try to pick them up. Also in Old Garbo, he mentions the bells of St. Mary's Church, which he could hear from a mile away. In Castle Square, there is a water sculpture with a quote around its base from a Dylan poem. Near here is an old haunt of Dylan's, mentioned in Old Garbo and Return Journey. Then it was called the Three Lamps. Dylan stayed in the Bush Hotel High Street before going to London and then the United States in 1953. The King's Arm High Street was another haunt of Dylan before he went to the BBC offices for his radio broadcasts. These are the BBC offices where he made his earlier broadcasts, but not his very first. It was meant to be broadcast from here, but Dylan was in London and couldn't get back in time. So his first broadcast came from the BBC London offices. This is the old grammar school where Dylan attended. Dylan's father was a senior English master at the school. The school is mentioned in Dylan's work, including the fight with Daniel Jones. The Number 10 pub was a favourite of Dylan and the Singleton pub where he had lunch when he was a reporter. Dylan spent many an evening in the Mumbles area of Swansea, drinking what he would call oyster beer, part of the Mumbles being called Oystermouth after the oyster beds cultivated in the bay. He could be found in the Antelope, the Marine and the Mermaid, which is now apartments. Mumbles Lighthouse was mentioned by Dylan in Old Garbo. This building on Newton Road, Mumbles, used to be the Regal Cinema. In the story Old Garbo, he mentions seeing white lions here. This chapel in the village of Newton is where Dylan's auntie's husband was a minister of religion and who preached here. Dylan and his sister Nancy would attend chapel on Sunday morning, Sunday school, and then again in the evening. Dylan's last article for the South Wales Evening Post, titled The End of a Great Ministry, was about his aunt's husband's retirement from the church. In Summerland Lane, Newton, a plaque commemorates Dylan's time spent in Newton Village. Here at Caswell Bay, Dylan told Bert Trick his idea of a Welsh version of Ulysses, which later became Under Milk Wood. In 1937, Dylan's father moved to the village of Bishopston Gower and lived at Marston 133 Bishopston Road. It was here that Dylan wrote his longest poem, The Ballad of the Long-Legged Bait, 216 lines. Rossilly Gower is where Dylan camped with some friends and wrote about it in his story Extraordinary Little Cough. Dylan was stranded on the Worm's Head Rossilly, cut off by the rising tide, and he wrote about it in his story Who Do You Wish Was With You? The Worm's Head Hotel was once owned by a friend of Dylan, and Dylan thought about moving to Rossilly until a friend told him there wasn't a pub within striking distance. Newquay Ceredigion is where the famous Majoda incident took place. After an argument with a companion and Dylan in a pub in the town, war veteran Captain Killick armed himself with grenade and machine gun and fired through the windows of Majoda, the home of Dylan and Caitlin. Tenby is the birthplace of artist Augustus John. When Caitlin and Dylan met, she was the model and reluctant mistress of John. Some months later, Dylan and Augustus John fought over Caitlin, and while Augustus won the fight, Dylan won the girl. Dylan and Augustus later became good friends. 30 miles west of Swansea is the small medieval town of Larne, where Dylan and his wife first lived in Eros, 2 Gosport Street. They then moved to Seaview Up Street. There was no electricity and no money. In debt to the local tradesmen, they left to live in Hampshire. In 1939, Dylan and Caitlin returned to Larne and lived in the boathouse, which today is a visitor centre for people to see where Dylan lived and worked. Before living in the boathouse, they stayed for a while in Castle House, a Georgian building. Brown's Hotel was a favourite drinking spot, as well as the Three Mariners. But wherever he drank, he made sure he was back in the writing shed by 7 p.m, where much of Under Milk Wood was written. After his tragic and early death in New York, Dylan was finally brought back to his final resting place, St. Martin's Church in Larne. There is no grand monument or gravestone where Dylan and Caitlin lie, just a plain white cross with Caitlin's name on one side and Dylan on the other. But then Dylan Thomas may lie here, but his monument is in his poetry and short stories. They are an enduring legacy and a continuing testament to his life.